So we've spent a lot of time in previous videos discussing elasticity, price elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand, cross-price elasticity of demand, and price elasticity of supply. And with price elasticity of demand, we spent some time talking about the usefulness of this measure for firms as they're trying to figure out how to maximize their revenues in order to maximize their profits. In this last video for this chapter, I want to look at an example of how these concepts also can be used in policy making. So specifically, let's think about wanting to create a policy that decreases illegal drug use. So do you think the demand for illegal drugs is relatively elastic or inelastic, and why? Think about your answer to this question. So likely, demand for illegal drugs is relatively inelastic because there often are no substitutes for the drug that a particular person is addicted to. No substitutes, or very few substitutes. It may make up a small percent of your income, how much you're spending on them. And then the big one really is that addiction increases your willingness to pay. It becomes almost a necessity for you. And purchases often are made in the immediate or short run without a lot of time to adjust or think about choosing a dealer on this side of town versus the other side of town in order to change your behavior with price, right? So for several reasons, I think primarily for the addiction element, demand for illegal drugs is often relatively inelastic. So suppose we want to enact a policy with the following goals. We want to greatly decrease drug consumption, and we want to make drug dealing a less attractive business, right? We want to decrease activity on both sides of the market, right? So the question that a policymaker may ask is, should we try to decrease the supply of drugs by increasing law enforcement on the streets, going in and taking supply out of the hands of suppliers, locking up dealers, those sorts of things, decreasing supply of drugs? Or should we try to decrease demand for drugs by maybe having better access to rehab programs, better education programs in schools to teach children not to begin interacting with drugs, those sorts of things. So which side of the market should we attack in order to be most successful in our policy goals? Elasticity can help us answer this question. Let's start by looking at what happens in the market if we focus on decreasing supply. So if we focus on going in with law enforcement, getting dealers off the street, confiscating drug supply, decreasing supply. So notice here in our diagram for a market for illegal drugs, what we see is a pretty inelastic demand curve, right? So it's fairly steep, which is probably true to the market for illegal drugs. So if we start enacting policies that decrease supply, we'll see supply shift to the left to S2 as shown here. What then happens in this market? We'll see an equilibrium shift from point E1 up and to the left to point E2, right? Which really is only a small decrease in drug transactions. We've gone just slightly to the left, while at the same time we've increased drug prices and increased drug revenues, which may actually make drug dealing more lucrative, right? So if you look at the revenue rectangle here, price times quantity, revenues originally were the blue box. Now we've increased revenues to the red box, or pink box, right? So we have this rectangle, the new price times the new quantity. We have actually greater drug revenues. Why is that? Because demand for the product is so inelastic that even if the price goes up, the quantity demanded doesn't change very much. And so we see a situation where revenues increase because of a price increase. So we actually have sort of shot ourselves in the foot. We have decreased supply of drugs, but we may have actually increased the attractiveness of drug dealing. What if, on the other hand, we enact policies to decrease demand? So if we see a leftward shift in demand, now what is the result? Now we see a larger decrease in quantity, right? So a much bigger change in the quantity of drug transactions. We see a decrease in price of drugs and ultimately a decrease in drug revenues. Now we have not only fewer drug transactions, but we also have made drug dealing less attractive. The moral of this story is that elasticity matters. Because demand is so inelastic in this market, really the way to have a real significant effect on the number of transactions and the attractiveness of drug dealing is to attack the inelastic side, attack the demand side, rather than the supply side. If we want to accomplish our two goals, a policy of decreasing drug demand will be better than trying to decrease drug supply, which means it's better to use our resources on education, offering legal substitutes, rather than increasing penalties and police enforcement. Oftentimes we see both happening in the real world. Increasing penalties and police enforcement are a lot of times much easier to do. So sometimes that's a policy that we see enacted just because it's simpler than trying to decrease demand. But what we see from this model, incorporating elasticity into the story, shows us that trying to go after the demand side actually will be a much more effective policy.